Hey guys, this is Mike, letusreason.com. I recently put out a video teaching on understanding the incredibly important and very famous prophecy that's found in Daniel 9:24-27. And this is the prophecy that speaks of a 70-week or a 490-year prophetic calendar for national Israel and the city of Jerusalem. And in that teaching, I explained how the prophecy begins with a 69-week or a 482-year prophetic countdown to the Messiah. It's 69 weeks, and then there's a final 70th week. But it's a 69-week prophetic countdown to the Messiah, which kicks off with a command to restore and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. Of course, it had been destroyed by the Babylonians. And we discussed how the decree of Artaxerxes, the Persian king, in 444 BC fulfilled this and kicked off or began or commenced this 69-week prophetic countdown to the Messiah. And then we discussed how the countdown ended in 33 AD, which is when Jesus Christ made what we today often refer to as his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Monday of the Passion Week. But another part of the prophecy from verse 24 had also listed 6 key objectives that the total 70 weeks would bring about. And it's obvious that those key objectives still today remain unfulfilled at the present time. And we talked about the necessity of seeing a gap of time inserted after the ending of the 69th week in 33 AD and the beginning of the 70th week, which remains future. And we discussed the post 69th week events, all the events that took place after the ending of the 69th week, like the crucifixion of the Messiah and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, which again necessitates a gap, that the 69th week paused in 33 AD with the countdown being fulfilled. And then there's this gap of time where these events that I just mentioned take place. And that gap is still ongoing, and the church fits into that gap period, where once it ends at the pre-trib rapture, God's focus is then going to begin to shift back to Israel for their final week of time, that 70th week. And during this future 70th week, those 6 key objectives that I mentioned are going to be brought to pass in order to allow Jesus to then introduce his millennial kingdom. And so that's a quick review of that teaching in that other video that I did. And feel free to look back at that video for more details. Obviously, I go into it in far more detail. Or if you're unfamiliar with this information, it's probably a good idea to start out with that one. It's background material for what we're going to have to discuss today. Of course, we're going to discuss a lot of the same information, but I'm able to go more in depth on certain issues in that one versus what I'm going to talk about today. So I hope this is going to be helpful for you, sort of as a part 2 to that recent video. Now, even in this video, we're going to go through and take somewhat of a verse-by-verse look at this prophecy, but the earlier verses in Daniel 9:24-27 won't get as much detail in this video as they did in that previous one. So again, hopefully it's going to be a review for a lot of you, but if not, I hope you learned something today. So in this video, we're going to focus on the identification of the somewhat mysterious mention of the he, the pronoun he in verse 27. We're going to try to understand what this pronoun refers to. And we basically have 3 choices: the Messiah, the Roman prince and general Titus Vespasian, or the Antichrist. But there's going to be a twist to this that you got to stick around till the end, because it's going to look like we're heading in one direction, but it's going to go far beyond that. And this subject is going to require us to go very in depth. So I hope you guys are all ready for this. All right. So the question is actually a very hotly debated conundrum within the different camps of Christian eschatology, or the study of the end times. And to be specific, it involves the mysterious shift that takes place between verses 26 and 27. Focusing on verse 26's reference to the prince that shall come, which is followed by verse 27's opening phrase, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So does this pronoun he in verse 27 refer to the Messiah, Titus Vespasian, or a future Antichrist figure? We're going to unpack all of this very systematically, verse by verse. So let's begin with verse 24, and we're going to start by reading it. And it says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, meaning the Jews and Jerusalem, to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. Okay, so verse 24 says that 70 weeks of years, a week of years meaning a grouping or a heptad of 7 years. And so there's 70 of them. And I'm not going to go too deep into this. It's in the other video. But 70 groupings of 7. So 70 times 7 equals 490 years. And they're designated by God for the future of the Jews and Jerusalem. And for what purpose? For the purpose of completing these 6 key objectives that I just read. And they primarily relate to Israel, since, of course, Israel, as we said, and as the passage just told you, is the subject of the prophecy unto your people and the holy city. And they point towards the culmination of the major biblical themes of this age, things like judgment of sin, atonement, forgiveness, and spiritual restoration. And again, I'm not going to go too deep into the specifics here. I do it in that other video. But the point that we need to recognize for the purpose of this video is that these 6 key objectives remain incomplete at this present time. And they're not going to be fully completed until the 70 weeks are completed. It takes the 70 weeks to bring those things to completion. Now, some of them, you can make an argument, might be partially fulfilled, looking back to the events of the crucifixion of Jesus. But in the ultimate sense, these objectives in totality will be brought to complete fulfillment when Israel is brought to spiritual restoration and revival at the time of the second coming of Christ and the inauguration of the future millennial kingdom that he's going to set up when he comes back. All right, so let's move on to verse 25. Let's read this one. It says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto or until the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times." Okay, here's what I mentioned earlier with the 69-week countdown to the arrival of the Messiah. As we pointed out earlier, we have a total of 70 weeks of years in this prophecy, or 490 years. But verse 25 focuses on the first 69 weeks of years of those 70 and separates them from the 70th. And it breaks them down into a first 7 weeks of years, followed immediately by 62 weeks of years, or 62 weeks, totaling 69. So it tells us that these 69 weeks of years would be a countdown that begins with a commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem, and then culminates with the appearance of the Messiah to Israel, the coming of the Messiah, the Prince. It's a countdown to the arrival of the Messiah, or what Christians would call the first coming or the first advent of Jesus Christ. Now, let me say that I know for sure I'm going to get comments arguing with what I'm about to say next, because there's a lot of alternative teaching, alternative date sequences, um, alternative beginning points and ending points going around on the internet about this. And there were a lot of comments on my other video about this. So if you have any problems with what I say next, I just want to point you to my free, very in-depth study entitled The Daniel 9:25 Prophecy, an exact timeline for the arrival of the Messiah, which is available on my website for anyone to download for free. Because in that study, we conclusively proved in great detail that this 69-week countdown began during the Hebrew month of Nisan in the year 444 BC with the decree of Artaxerxes, and then ended on March 30th of 33 AD at the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. And several days following this triumphal entry, he was then crucified on April 3rd, or Friday. which is a key point that comes into play in the next verse, verse 26, that he was crucified or cut off. We'll get there. So it's important for us to recognize that the first 69 weeks, this countdown to the coming of the Messiah, have concluded long ago, back in 33 AD. If you have any doubts on this, or you would like to understand the evidence for yourself, how we got these dates, again, feel free to look back at that study. And please do that before you leave me a comment, because I give you all the evidence for this in there. I tell you exactly how I came to these conclusions, and I cite sources. I lay it all out. So if you leave me a comment complaining about the dates or something, and it's something that I answer in that study, I'm just going to give you the link to it. All right, so let's now move on to verse 26. And this really starts to get into the debated topic that we're going to focus on today, because verse 26 says this: "And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war desolations are determined." All right, so verse 26 discusses events that occur after the completion of the 69 weeks. So this verse discusses the events that would follow the termination of the 69th week. It says after the 69 total weeks, the Messiah would then be cut off or killed, and that Jerusalem and the temple would then be destroyed by a prince who would come. And these are the post 69th week events that it speaks of. And these events did happen exactly as the prophecy predicts. Let me show you exactly how precise it was. And again, you can look back to my study on Daniel 9:25 to see the details about it. But the precision of the timing of the crucifixion was absolutely incredible. Where several days following the triumphal entry, or the ending of the 69th week, Jesus the Messiah was cut off or killed, exactly as it says. So in other words, the triumphal entry took place on Monday, ending the 69 weeks, and then Jesus was crucified on Friday of that same week in the year 33 AD. It's exactly as prophesied. And it actually does work out to be 69 prophetic weeks. And I go through all the calculations, 69 prophetic weeks of years, rather. I go through all the calculations for it in that study. So now let's quickly take a look at this term cut off. So there's absolutely no confusion about this. This is the Hebrew term or the Hebrew word karat. And this word literally means to be cut off, cut down, or cut asunder. It is often used to mean that a person will be executed or killed. Now, interestingly, this word was also used in ancient times to imply the cutting of a covenant, where two people would literally cut off a piece of animal flesh and walk in between the pieces while making covenant vows or promises. And a perfect example of this is what we see being done during the giving of the Abrahamic covenant by God to Abraham in Genesis 15. You can look further into that on your own time. But think about this: karat, cut off, but also the cutting off of a covenant. Well, is there any better word that does a better job of summarizing the work of Jesus on the cross, where he was cut off and rejected by his people, the Jews, and was then executed? But it goes even deeper. By laying down his life, Jesus brought the new covenant into effect. The cutting of a covenant, the establishing of a covenant. He was himself, his life was cut off in order to cut a covenant. So there should be no confusion about this expression cut off. Even in the Hebrew in verse 26. It means the Messiah would be executed after the conclusion of the 69 weeks, which Jesus was 4 days as we count following his triumphal entry. And then, as we also saw here in verse 26, there's a prophecy that Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed by a prince who would come. And the precision here, too, is unreal. There was a perfect fulfillment of this, exactly to the letter, that happened only about 40 years later, as the city and the sanctuary, Jerusalem and the temple, were destroyed by a prince who came. And this occurred in 70 AD. Now, you got to understand, our knowledge of the history of this time period is very well preserved and very well known. And history records in great detail the actions of the Roman prince and general Titus Vespasian, who led the assault on Jerusalem and the temple and destroyed them in 70 AD. To get more information on the details, I would refer you to my study called the Luke 19:43 to 44 prophecy, the destruction of Jerusalem foretold, because this event was foretold in extreme detail by Jesus himself. And I show in that study the Bible prophecies that concern this and then what history records happening. It's exact. But it all boils down to the fact that during the Jewish rebellion against Rome that began in the late 60s AD, around 66 AD to be exact, Titus's father Vespasian, who was also formerly a general, had now become the emperor of Rome. And he put Titus in charge of carrying out the rebellion or the military response to the rebellion. And he responded by surrounding and sieging the city of Jerusalem. And it ended up with him utterly destroying the city and the temple in 70 AD, where many Jews were massacred and killed, and so many others were sold into slavery throughout the empire. But the thing to recognize is that Titus Vespasian had just become a prince, since, as we said, his father had just become the emperor, exactly as the prophecy stated. And like the prophecy also said, the end came for Jerusalem in its destruction in 70 AD. And following that, the war continued with its desolations, as history so thoroughly records, where the entire countryside just gets absolutely leveled. And we can see all of this in the writings of the first century Jewish historian Josephus, who was an eyewitness. And I have the full works of Josephus sitting right here on my bookshelf. And it's definitely something that you probably want to add to your library if you're building it. But it didn't end there, as the Jewish people then, over the next century, would be sent into a worldwide diaspora, as we refer to it, as the desolations would then continue and find further fulfillment in the events of the 130s AD. That's kind of when it came to a head, as the Roman Emperor Hadrian at that time would again squash another rebellion after a false messiah figure that they called Bar Kokhba rose up. And so this time the Romans just had enough of all of it, and they ended up completely leveling the city, rebuilding a new city on top of it that they called Aelia Capitolina. And they built a temple of the pagan god Jupiter over the place where the Jewish temple and the Holy of Holies had once stood. Think about that. And so when you really think about the precision of the fulfillment of that prophecy, it's really hard to imagine a more desolating outcome than that. It's perfect. It's exactly what it said. Well, okay, so at this point, we've discussed the first through the 69th weeks, as well as the events that took place after the 69th week, that I call the post 69th week events. But notice that we, and the passage so far in Daniel 9, has not yet discussed the 70th week. There's been no discussion about that so far. So let's now move on to look at verse 27, where this final 70th week is going to be mentioned. And it says this: "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate." All right, so verse 27 seems to make an unusual jump forward past the post 69th week events that we just talked about to now beginning to describe the start of the mysterious 70th week. But if you look at this closely, it gives no description of how the events that followed the 69th week that we just talked about link into the 70th week. It doesn't tell you when it starts in relation to them in terms of a timeline. It doesn't say whether it's immediate or if there's some time in between. So, in other words, our understanding of the previous verse, verse 26, is very clear that the 69 weeks were completed in 33 AD, and it tells us of the events that occur after their completion, which forces us to recognize, as we look back in time, that between the 69th and 70th weeks, there's a gap of time. You need to let that sink in. This is very important. The 69 weeks concluded on March 30th of 33 AD at the triumphal entry. And then after that, Jesus the Messiah was cut off 4 days later. So there's a gap right there. Small gap, 4 days, but it's a gap. But then still even further after that, the city and the sanctuary, Jerusalem and the temple, were destroyed. And that took place almost 40 years later in 70 AD. So any way you cut it, this passage mandates a gap of time following the 69 weeks. No matter how you try to frame it, there's a minimum of almost 40 years right there. Now that's the key word, is minimum, because we're going to find out that this gap is still ongoing today, because almost 2,000 years later, it's still ongoing. The 70th week has not yet begun. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's back up and try to see this clearly. So when we look at verse 27 and we notice how it describes the final 70th week, the question then becomes, when should we understand this final week to occur? Did it occur sometime around 70 AD, or is it yet future? Did it have anything to do with what happened in 70 AD, which is described in verse 26? Or is there a gap of time that is still ongoing? Well, the only point of continuity or linkage with the previous verse, verse 26, is the use of the pronoun he, which would seem to refer back to the antecedent, the prince that shall come, in verse 26. We're told that a covenant is going to be enforced or confirmed, which would clearly seem to be the marker for the beginning of this final 70th week. Now remember, it said, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. It's a mention of one final week, because verse 24 had told us there would be a total of 70, and we're then told about the completion of the 69th. So this is obviously talking about the 70th. And if you read it very carefully, it seems that it will take place sometime after the gap of time in which the post-69th week events take place: the crucifixion of the Messiah and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And that when it eventually happens, its beginning point is going to be marked by this confirmation of a covenant. And after that, we're then told of a marker that seems to designate the middle of the 70th week. Because it said, and in the midst of the week, or in the middle of the week, he, that same he that confirmed the covenant, shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, referring to the temple sacrifices. Okay, so because it's so ambiguous here with this mysterious he, there's a lot of confusion as to whether these events, the 70th week, have already happened, or if we should understand them to be future events. And who is this he? All right, so let's start by talking about that. The question really is, does the he that's mentioned in verse 27 refer to the Messiah, who was originally mentioned in verse 25, and then mentioned again in the beginning of verse 26? Or does the he refer to the prince that shall come that's mentioned later in verse 26? Well, this has been the topic of much debate. And while some people believe it refers to the Messiah, the prince, originally mentioned in verse 25, as we said, others believe it refers to the prince that shall come, mentioned toward the end of verse 26, which we've already identified with Titus Vespasian. Well, most simply put, in normal laws of reference in language, a pronoun always refers back to the last preceding person mentioned. So in this case, like we said, the antecedent is the prince that shall come in verse 26. So in other words, the Messiah was mentioned before the prince that shall come. So it'd be unusual and sort of confusing for the text to use a pronoun to jump all the way back to the Messiah as being the subject that was intended. Because in normal speech, if you use a pronoun, it should refer to the antecedent, the last person mentioned. Otherwise, you would clarify who you meant by specifying who their name is or their title or something instead of just the pronoun. But those who think that he does refer all the way back to the Messiah, I just want to address this first, they face a number of other problems too. For example, if the he is taken to mean the Messiah, and this mention of he shall confirm the covenant with many is then taken to mean Christ confirming the new covenant, which is what many of them have suggested, then it immediately runs into some major problems because the new covenant is obviously longer than 7 years in duration. Remember, this he is confirming a covenant for 7 years, or the final 70th week. So then why would it say Jesus is confirming the new covenant for 7 years? That just doesn't make any sense. The new covenant, as we know, is everlasting. And of course, it's not limited to 7 years. So this really just doesn't make any sense at all. But the problems don't stop there, because what these people who think he in verse 27 refers to the Messiah, what they often try to do is split the final week into 2 parts with a gap in the middle. And they apply the first half of the final 7 years to Jesus's earthly ministry. They say that it was like the 3.5 years of Jesus's ministry. And then the final half, they try to squeeze into the events of 70 AD. But doing that would overlap the 70th week with the 69th week, which I show in the Daniel 9:25 study where I go into all the details on the dating. I show this conclusively, that the 69 weeks are still in progress until 33 AD. So in other words, obviously the 70th week can't begin until the 69th week concludes. Well, they're trying to squeeze the first half of the 70th week back into the time period when the 69th week is still ongoing. You can't do that. And further yet, there are no noteworthy events to designate as markers that would conclude the midpoint of the 70th week if you applied this to the years following 33 AD. There's no way to do this. You can't say it was Jesus's ministry, and you can't then tack it on to the end, after 33 AD and say, we'll add 3.5 years to 33 AD, and that's the first half of the 70th week. No. It doesn't work. There's no events that work because, first of all, you're commingling Israel's 70 weeks with the church age. That's the problem number one, which should, by definition, be distinct. Remember, this is a prophecy for Israel and Jerusalem, not for the church. But even more, like I said, there's no good reasons for doing that in the first place because there's no events that you can use as justification. Nothing significant happened 3.5 years after 33 AD that in any way can relate to this prophecy. So none of it really fits at all. Now, some people, they also try to connect the prince that shall come in verse 26 with being the Messiah mentioned in verse 25, but that obviously falls apart, since the passage itself says that Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed by the people of the prince that shall come. And history, of course, shows that Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, not by the Jews, because the Jews are the people of the Messiah. So it can't refer to the Messiah. But the most problematic issue for a Messiah view, for the he in verse 27, going back to that, is probably the great number of parallel prophetic passages, which we're going to be mentioning some of them shortly, that clearly identify the 70th week as a future time period. And here's the key, that it terminates with the second coming of Christ. We know very clearly from multiple passages in the scriptures that the 70th week terminates with the second coming of Christ. And this is a future 7-year period of time called the Tribulation. Since the tribulation and the second coming of Christ are clearly and obviously portrayed in scripture as future events, with the second coming taking place at the end of it, which obviously hasn't happened yet, so obviously it's still future, then this requires a futurist interpretation of this prophecy. So the better interpretation of the pronoun he is in reference to the prince that shall come. But it gets much more complicated than that, because now we've created what may initially seem to be an even bigger problem. Because the next obvious question becomes, If the pronoun he refers to the prince that shall come, who we already identified as Titus Vespasian back in the first century, how can this prophecy be said to be future? And how can it refer to the Antichrist? How can this 70th week be a future time period? So let's begin to explore the answer to this question. The answer is kind of simple, but it's going to take some time to really unpack. It's simple if you understand Bible prophecy and you understand some peculiarities, some characteristics that are routinely seen throughout the scriptures when it comes to Bible prophecy. But the problem is most people are not very familiar with those. So the answer may be simple, but it's going to take some time to go through. But the first thing that we need to do is understand one of the competing views to futurism, which is called preterism. The people who believe in this view are called preterists, and they interpret verse 27 to have already been fulfilled in the first century AD with the destruction of Jerusalem and the events around 70 AD. So preterism is a Christian eschatological view of the end times that interprets the end times as being events which have already been fulfilled in the past. So everything that a futurist would refer to as being yet to be fulfilled in the future, their preterists are going to say, no, all that stuff was already fulfilled in 70 AD. So there's not really any end time Bible prophecy to look forward to as still being something that needs to take place. And the term preterism comes from the Latin word praeter, meaning past. So everything's happened in the past. And preterism is directly opposed to futurism, obviously, as we said, because we see the end times prophecies as having that still future fulfillment. Now, you may have heard of some very well-known preterists, people like R.C. Sproul or Kenneth Gentry, N.T. Wright, people like this. And it might help you to understand a little bit about why preterism was invented and where it comes from. Well, preterism was first suggested by the Jesuit priest Luis de Alcazar during the Counter-Reformation. And if you don't know what the Counter-Reformation is, it's exactly as it sounds. It was sort of a Catholic revival to try to oppose or counter the Protestant Reformation. So the Counter-Reformation. And the invention of the preterist view had a purpose. And it's no wonder that it came about at this particular point in time, because it served to bolster the Catholic Church's position against the attacks of Protestants, who at that time were very consumed with their anti-Catholic sentiments that they would commonly identify the Pope as being the Antichrist. So preterism was a way of saying, no, the Pope can't be the Antichrist, since all that end times Bible prophecy stuff was really fulfilled all the way back in the first century. And Nero or some Roman emperor back then was actually the Antichrist. So it's helpful to understand that preterism was invented by the Jesuit order as a way of clapping back at the Protestant Reformation. Should be enough said on that, right? Tells you all you need to know. But it's interesting to note that none of the early church fathers also ever embraced it. And you'll never, ever look back into the writings of the early church fathers and find them making any of these claims that everything eschatology related already happened. Now, I don't take my views on eschatology necessarily from the church fathers, but it's interesting to look back and see that in the views of the early church fathers, it's always the opposite. The early church always looked forward in time towards a future fulfillment of end times prophecy. And preterism really falls apart when you recognize that the book of Revelation was written in 95 AD, around 25 years after the events that it describes supposedly already happened back in 70 AD, according to preterists. But never let the facts get in the way of good political propaganda, right? Now, another typical aspect of preterism is the belief that national Israel finds its continuation or its fulfillment in the Christian church after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So, in other words, preterism falls into the camp of replacement theology, which is this idea that the church has replaced Israel permanently in God's program, which is intensely problematic for no shortage of reasons that we just can't get into here. But getting back to the he in Daniel 9:27, you need to understand that preterists generally attribute the complete fulfillment of Daniel 9:27 to the actions of Titus Vespasian and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. That's what we're saying. And we need to talk about this because it seems like I also, just identified the he in 27 with Titus. I mean, that's what I said, right? But stay with me. Like I said, it gets more complicated. So preterists have noticed the similarities between the actions of Titus that took place in 70 AD and the content of verse 27, where it says, "He shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate." Well, history shows us that you can say Titus put an end to sacrifice and offering by destroying Jerusalem and the temple. He did. And the Romans set up their pagan emblems on the eastern wing of the temple and offered sacrifices to them. The Jewish Roman historian who I mentioned before, Josephus, who was there in person, records all of this. And you can find it in his book, The Wars of the Jews, book 6, chapter 6.3. So with that being said, then at quick glance, and when isolating this passage from the rest of the biblical commentary on the 70th week, this preterist interpretation that it all happened back in 70 AD might appear a little bit convincing. But yet, when we utilize a systematic, precise, literal reading of all the parallel biblical passages that also discuss the 70th week, what we're to expect to happen at that time, we find that this preterist view is just indefensible. It completely falls apart. So we have to keep in mind that numerous future end time discourses in the New Testament were given based upon this template of Daniel 9:24 to 27. It is the prophetic scaffolding that the rest of end times prophecy, the rest of Bible prophecy falls into. So there's numerous other end times discourses given that link up or align with what we see in Daniel 9:27 specifically. So some prime examples of this are Jesus's Olivet Discourse that I talk about a lot on this channel in Matthew 24 and other Gospels. And then also Paul's teaching on the eschatological day of the Lord in 2 Thessalonians 2. Obviously, also the apocalyptic prophecies that we see in Revelation 6 to 19. So we can't really get into an exploration of all those in this article, but I trust that most of you who are at least somewhat literate in Bible prophecy know basically what they're about. And any simple investigation that you can do on your own time will reveal that these prophecies, these passages all act as parallel or clarifying biblical commentary on the events of the 70th week. And they all expound further on this particular verse, verse 27. And when you just read them plainly, in a literal way, consistently literally, it requires a future context of interpretation, which means that the events of verse 27 that were described cannot have found ultimate fulfillment back in the first century or any other time up until the present, because we've never seen the fulfillments of these things. So these are parallel prophecies, and there's others as well, and they all describe the 70th week as a future end times period that involves the desecrating actions of this figure that we call the Antichrist, and that it ends with the second coming of Christ physically to the earth, which has not happened yet. You would think somebody would have noticed. All the things that happened in Revelation, that are prophesied in Revelation, all these cosmic judgments that I think somebody would have noticed, never happened. So the only biblically coherent way that we have to understand the 70th week, as it's described here in verse 27, is through the futurist interpretation that it's still going to happen in the future. And this was no mystery to the early church. Like we said, it was universal. It was a universal expectation that all of this was yet to come. Nobody in the first couple of centuries looked back to the first century and said, it's been all done. I guess Jesus is here. Don't see him. Didn't see anything the Bible said is going to happen. Happened. I didn't see any of it, but I guess it happened. Nobody did that. So there was really nothing difficult about this. So that's just a little bit of background for you. So now we can begin to focus our attention on the actual question at hand, the question that we posed earlier, which is if the pronoun he in verse 27 refers to the prince that shall come, who we already identified as Titus Vespasian in verse 26, like preterists would agree with, then how can this prophecy be yet future? How can I be connecting this with Titus in verse 26 and yet say verse 27, the he refers to him, but yet we're saying verse 27 is some future time period that's going to involve an Antichrist? How can I make that claim? Well, in order to further answer this question, we need to make note of, I mentioned it before, a couple of very key peculiarities or characteristics that we repeatedly note in prophetic scripture. Now, the first is that we really shouldn't be surprised that between verse 26 and verse 27, there exists a gap of time. Now, if there's a significant gap here, which I'm saying it's been almost 2,000 years and counting, if there's a significant gap like that, then that fact alone allows us to understand that the he in verse 26 cannot be the same he in verse 27. So it can't really completely refer to Titus, because he wouldn't still be alive, obviously. You might say, but Mike, I thought you just said it did refer to Titus. Yeah, I did, but stay with me. It's going to make sense in a bit. Hang on tight. But we shouldn't be surprised about there being a significant gap of time here between these two verses, because this is a somewhat common thing in Bible prophecy, where in the course of a single line, or even in the space of one single comma, it jumps from one fulfillment event to another, being sometimes hundreds or even thousands of years apart. This is common in Bible prophecy, guys. And we might refer to these as hidden intervals or gaps in prophecy. And I did a video on this a while back called The Mountain Peaks of Prophecy and the Hidden Church Age. But this is a common occurrence in Bible prophecy, often due to the hidden nature of the church age in God's prophetic program, where the Bible tells us that the church was a mystery entity that was hidden. It was hidden from view all throughout the Old Testament. And some people today have looked back on this and illustrated it, because a picture is always worth 1,000 words. They've illustrated this concept as a series of mountain peaks, which are separated by a valley that lays in between, where the first mountain peak represents the events of the first coming or the first advent of the Messiah. And then the next taller mountain peaks represent the events of the second coming and then the millennial kingdom that immediately follows. You could take a look at the chart that I put on the screen for a visual of this. And in between the first two mountain peaks, there sits a valley encompassing the church age, which was below the line of vision for the prophets in the Old Testament. They could see the mountain peaks in the distance, and from their view, from their vantage point, they seem to follow each other sequentially without gaps or interruptions. They seem to be right next to each other. But from their vantage point, they couldn't tell that between those between those mountains was a valley. So in other words, they couldn't know that there was a 2,000 or more year church age that separated the events that they saw. And all these things were beneath their line of sight. They couldn't see it. They couldn't make it out. And I'm sure you guys can relate to this if you've ever been out near a mountain range, been driving out west or something like that. It looks from a distance like the mountains are all side by side. But as you get closer, you can see that there's actually space in between them, maybe a valley, a river, maybe even a town or a city or multiple towns or cities that you cannot see from far away until you get right up close to it. You can see that there's something separating them. So I'll give you an example from where I live in northern New Jersey, where if I look out toward the Manhattan skyline, from my vantage point, it looks massive, and it really is. But as you get closer, you can start to see that on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River and the New York Harbor is the Jersey City skyline. But from far away, it looks blended right in with the Manhattan skyline, so that you would think it's all the same city, even though there's a river that goes in between it. And then as you get even closer, you can see that some of the buildings from downtown Brooklyn are visible on the other side of the East River, which is on the other side of Manhattan. But from far away, it all looks like it's this one huge, massive New York City skyline. And so that's the same concept with the mountains and with the mountain peaks of prophecy, where the Old Testament prophets couldn't make out that there lay a prophetic gap period called the church age in between the first and second advents, those mountain peak events. Their prophecies often discuss events fulfilled at Christ's first coming, and they seemingly flow right into the events that are going to take place at his second coming. Well, through the benefit of hindsight and the New Testament scriptures, we can now see that they skip over, in actuality, several thousand years of time, this gap of time that we've experienced so far in the church age. And it might continue. We don't know how long it's going to go. But if while you're initially reading these prophecies, you didn't already know that there was a mystery gap period called the church age inserted in between, you would think that they're all continuous, uninterrupted prophecies where one occurs right after the next without any gap of time. So I hope this makes sense. Let me show you an example of this. This is a clear gap that you can see in Zechariah chapter 9, and it's between verses 9 and 10, where verse 9 is a clear prophecy related to Christ's first coming. It describes his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. What we talked about, it's actually a prophecy of the ending of the 69th week that occurred in Jerusalem several days prior to his crucifixion. But then look at verse 10. It immediately moves to a second coming context. It prophetically talks about the glorious return that's going to take place, where the conquering King Messiah comes back and defeats his enemies and establishes his millennial reign on the earth. So you can see this huge gap in between. Let's take a look at this. Verse 9 says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass." And so I talk about that more in great depth in the last video that I did on this, where this describes Jesus entering into Jerusalem. It was the only time in his prophetic ministry that he ever allowed himself to be proclaimed as a king, as a messianic king. And it was in fulfillment of this prophecy. But let's then look at what verse 10 says, the next verse. It immediately says, "And I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, and the horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall speak peace unto the heathen, and his dominion shall be from sea even to sea, and from the river even unto the ends of the earth." So, from an Old Testament perspective, prior to Christ, you'd be very hard pressed to recognize a prophetic gap that separates these two verses. They seem to just flow together, like the fulfillment of verse 10 would immediately follow what happens in verse 9. But between the events of Christ's two comings lies the church age, which is a mystery intercalation in God's program. And I'd hate for you to think that this is something weird that I just made up myself. So I'm going to share with you the words of one Bible scholar named Dr. Warren Wiersbe, and he addresses these passages that I just showed you. And he writes this. He says, "The entire age of the church fits between Zechariah 9:9 and 9:10, just as it does between Isaiah 9:6 and 7, and after the comma in Isaiah 61:2. So he also mentions the same kind of thing happening in Isaiah 9:6 to 7, which should be, I think, very familiar to most people. It's on our Christmas cards every year. But let's take a closer look at it, because we sometimes read these verses without really understanding what they're saying. So let's look at verse 6, and it says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." And then verse 7 says, "Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this." So Isaiah's prophecy of a child being born and a son being given obviously refers to Jesus' incarnation at his first coming. But then notice how the passage immediately transitions to a second coming context in everything that follows. Now, Dr. Wearsby, in that quote, he seems to say that the transition takes place between the two verses. But the reality is that when we look at this a little bit closer, the government has never yet been upon Jesus' shoulder. And this won't take place until he establishes his earthly reign following his second coming. So that really hasn't happened yet. And Jesus also has never been called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace by the Jewish nation that he was sent to, who this prophecy was given to. So this is also not going to occur until all of Israel is brought to faith around the time of the second coming and then the establishment of the millennial kingdom. So in reality, the gap I think we can say is actually located inside verse 6, between these two phrases, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. And then verse 7 then continues on to describe the establishment of Christ's earthly reign in the millennial kingdom, which follows his second coming. So again, without the benefit of hindsight and the New Testament, it would seem as if you're looking at these back then in the Old Testament times, you would kind of expect that these prophecies just flow together immediately, one after the next. There's no obvious indication in the verse itself that there's 2,000 years or more in between them. But because we can look back on them with the clarity of the New Testament revelation and look back on it through history, we can see that it becomes very obvious that there's this mystery time gap called the church age that separates them. But Wearsby also mentions Isaiah 61:2, and this is probably the most classic example of this type of hidden gap phenomena in the whole Bible, where Jesus Christ himself interprets it for us in Luke 4:16-19. This passage records how at the beginning of his ministry, Jesus stood up in the synagogue when it was his time to read, and he opened to the book of the prophet Isaiah. He went to Isaiah chapter 61. He went on to read verses 1-2, which was a prophecy that proclaimed his mission at his first coming. And he finishes his reading with his first coming mandate of to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. Now, what you probably don't realize without actually going back to Isaiah to read that original prophecy is that Jesus stopped reading right in the middle of a sentence, where if you were to continue on in Isaiah's prophecy, it continues and says, "And the day of vengeance of our God." So what's going on here? Jesus stopped reading at the comma right before that phrase, "and the day of vengeance of our God." He purposely left that segment out. Why? Because we now understand that after that comma, the prophecy jumped from the time of the Messiah's first coming to some several thousand years or more into the future, past the present time that we're living in now, to the time of his second coming. Because the day of vengeance was not part of his mission during his first coming. It's going to be fulfilled at his second coming. So in that original prophecy in Isaiah, we can say that one single comma separating those two phrases separates several thousand years of history so far to date. But again, this gap would have been unknown and absolutely undetectable to the original readers back then. It would seem to have just flowed together, one right after the next with no gap. And so those are just two examples of many that I could show you. But the point is that this is common in Bible prophecy. And it's because of the mystery or hidden nature of the church age in Old Testament prophecy. And this is exactly what we see also happening in Daniel 9:26-27, as thousands of years separate these two verses. And yet, from a casual reading, they seem to flow together, one after the next. So hear me on this. This explains how the timing context of verse 26 can involve the first century, while the timing context of verse 27 can involve the future 70th week. It explains how there can be this gap, even though no obvious gap is explicit in the actual text. So it explains the timing context, but it doesn't yet explain the personal context. So, in other words, it still doesn't explain how the personal context can shift from Titus Vespasian in verse 26 to the future Antichrist in verse 27. Because if the he in verse 27 refers back to the antecedent, like we said, Titus Vespasian, the prince that shall come in verse 26, then how can we say the Antichrist is intended? Well, in Scripture, there's another peculiarity that we need to look at. It's found in prophetic context, and we need to understand it. And that's the somewhat common occurrence of what we might call multiple reference prophecies, where in these prophecies, it's very clear in the beginning who the original subject is. But then at some point in the text, the prophecy clearly begins to transcend that local, more immediate person or situation and point to a person or situation of far greater significance who's going to act as the ultimate fulfillment. Sometimes it's more obvious than others. So let's give some examples of this. I could give you many. The Bible is full of them, but this video is already getting pretty long. So I'm going to give you one great example of a multiple reference prophecy, and it's found in the book of Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 28:12-19. And it gives a description of somebody that it calls the king of Tyre. Tyre was an ancient city. And although there was an actual historical person who was the actual king of the actual historical place called Tyre, the description that the Bible gives of this person at some point in the text very clearly seems to go far beyond just describing this actual human leader. So, in other words, the text starts out with Ezekiel first talking about the actual historical king of Tyre, but then at some point in the prophecy, he seems to move his context into the dateless past with a description of the original fall of Satan himself. This makes sense because Satan was the true power behind the earthly king of Tyre. So it's sort of using an earthly personage to get at the real power behind that personage, the real point, what's really happening behind it. The Bible does this a lot. This also seems to be happening here in Daniel 9:26 and 27, where verse 26 obviously refers to the actions of Titus Vespasian. It fits perfectly. And yet we understand from the many other parallel prophetic passages that I referred to before in Scripture that the events of verse 27 must be yet future. And so even though the pronoun he from verse 26 is carried into verse 27 without any obvious change in context that we can see, we understand from those other parallel supporting passages that the he in verse 27 clearly transcends Titus, and it instead refers to the coming Antichrist in the future, the end times 70th week. But I do want to suggest a possibility here, which is that it's even possible that the events of verse 27 as a whole do find a typological near-term fulfillment in the events of 70 AD, where Titus Vespasian and the events of 70 AD may in some way be a prophetic type, sort of the way that we think of a prototype. It could be a prophetic type of the future Antichrist and his future actions. This is also very common in Bible prophecy. And people get tripped up in thinking that a prophetic type is the ultimate final antitype. But as usual with typology, the type is not completely identical in all ways to the antitype. And this is perfectly compatible with the futurist interpretation because futurists recognize the routine use of these kind of multiple stage fulfillment or multiple reference prophecies in the Bible, as we just outlined. So you might also hear some of these being referred to as dual reference prophecies or near-term, far-term fulfillment prophecies, where sometimes the event that's being prophesied ripples forward many times in history before it's ultimately fulfilled. How many types were there of Jesus in the Old Testament? You could make a case almost that in some ways, almost every main figure prefigured Christ in at least one way. But only the ultimate fulfillment event perfectly mirrors the biblical description of many of the prophecies. So let me give you an example of that. And it's also from the book of Daniel. We find something very similar in Daniel 11:31, which is another place, just like Daniel 9:27, where we find this term abomination of desolation being mentioned, which futurist scholars understand this passage, what's being talked about here, to have both a near term and a far term fulfillment. This is how prophetic typology works. And there's no limit to the number of types that can take place. It's often a reoccurring pattern that has the purpose of prefiguring an ultimate future far term fulfillment event. It's what makes the Bible so incredible. One of the many things. So going to this example in Daniel 11:31, in the near-term sense, this passage very clearly refers historically to the events that took place in the year 167 BC, where there was this Greek Seleucid king who was called Antiochus Epiphanes. And he set up an idol of Zeus in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And he also sacrificed a pig on the altar. He did a whole lot more than that, but I'm summarizing. And this historical abomination of desolation, which would be known to any Jewish person at the time of Jesus, and today too, really, is what led to the Maccabean revolt, where the Maccabees led a Jewish rebellion, and the Greeks, the Seleucids, were kicked out of Judea, and the temple was cleansed and rededicated after that desolating event with the idol of Zeus and the pig. So you know how Jewish people feel about pigs being unclean. So you can imagine how they felt about a pig being brought into the temple and sacrificed on the altar. So they have to cleanse and rededicate the temple after they kicked out the Greeks. And this rededication of the temple is what's commemorated and celebrated by the Jewish people every year at Hanukkah. So this is very well known historically. You ask any Jew what the abomination of desolation was, historically, this is what they'll tell you. But in the far term sense, the passage in Daniel 11 also appears to transcend this historical abomination in 167 BC, or at least the biblical mentions of the abomination of desolation have a future fulfillment. And they find this ultimate future fulfillment in the actions of the Antichrist during the future 70th week. And we know this for many reasons, but maybe most obviously in the fact that Jesus, over 150 years later, after 167 BC, referred to this event as being future. He called it by name, the abomination of desolation. It's recorded in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24:15. He mentions it as a future event. So in other words, he implies basically that this past historical event would be recapitulated, done again, in a future final abomination of desolation that will constitute the final ultimate fulfillment. So he's taking something historical that any Jewish person knew about, and he's saying it's going to happen again, even worse, in a more final sense, in a more ultimate sense, in the future. And this also seems to be what the Apostle Paul refers to when he talks about the Antichrist setting himself up to be worshipped, standing in the temple in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. But further yet, this future understanding is also confirmed in the fact that the Daniel 11 narrative, which flows into Daniel 12, like the Matthew 24 narrative, ends with the second coming of Christ. I want you to take a look at both of these prophetic chapters when you have some time, if you're not familiar with them, where they both end with the second coming of Christ. So then this chapter in Daniel, it's Daniel 11. It ends with the second coming of Christ. It's yet another example of a prophecy that begins to transcend the local, near-term historical application, and it ends with a future, far more significant and more ultimate event that clearly is yet to take place. And like Daniel 9, 26 and 27, the topic of this video, you're going to find that Daniel 11 also skips over several thousand years of the church age. And it culminates in describing that second coming, which is talked about early in chapter 12. The content of verse 11 or chapter 11 goes right into chapter 12. It's one continuous prophecy, and it ends with the second coming. So this concept alone of the second coming taking place at the end of all these passages refutes the preterist view that all this has already happened. If it already happened, when did the second coming take place? Well, they have to allegorize it away because there's really no way to say it took place. There is no physical way to say that a physical coming of Christ took place so far in history. They can't say it. But they've invented a way around this. It's called partial preterism, where everything has happened except for the actual second coming. All prophecy, everything in Revelation, everything in Daniel, everything that's talked about in the future, the Olivet Discourse, everything Paul talked about, it's all happened already except for Christ actually coming. This is partial preterism. But not so that you'd notice, right? If the cosmic judgments of Revelation did happen, I don't know, I think somebody might remember it, maybe write it down in a history book or something. Might be a memorable thing. But anyway, I'm sure that you can see the problems with preterism just make it indefensible. And so Scripture is very clear that these 70th week events conclude with the second coming of Christ. That's what we're saying. So this prophecy of an abomination of desolation that we see here in Daniel 11:31 did describe an actual historical event that did occur in the past, but yet we also understand it to be a type or just another prophetic ripple or a shadow of an ultimate fulfillment that's yet to come. And like I mentioned, this may be the case also in Daniel 9:27 with the actions of Titus Vespasian in 70 AD. But at most, they only act as a shadow, not an ultimate fulfillment, not the final fulfillment. It's just, you could say that it's a shadow in the events of Titus Vespasian, where it's this prophetic ripple in time of something yet future that's going to still happen in the most ultimate sense in the 70th week in the end times. And as is the case in many of these instances, like I said before, the near-term fulfillment doesn't perfectly fit what the prophecy requires for the final ultimate fulfillment. Because I want you to think about this. A type, that's kind of what a type is. That's the definition. A type is not a perfect picture of the fulfillment. It's just a type. It's a prototype. The final construct always comes out looking better or more full than a prototype or a blueprint. It's just to give you an idea. Think about it in the terms of a shadow, because the Bible also equates a type or typology with that term of a shadow. It's a shadow of things to come. It's a shadow of a fulfillment. Think about a shadow. A shadow is hazy. It's indistinct. It doesn't have well-defined edges and you can't make out the details. It's just dark and you can't really see the details, the fine points. But the actual object that casts the shadow is very detailed and very well defined. So this is the same concept with Bible prophecy, with typology. And it's another evidence that even if we say Titus was a type, he can't be the final future fulfillment, the ultimate fulfillment, because the description of the events of 70 AD don't line up perfectly enough. If you're going to take the Bible seriously, then you can't say that Titus fulfilled it. You just can't. What happened in 70 AD does fit in some ways, but not in all ways. So even if we ignore the many other parallel passages that do require, as we said, an end times context, there are a number of other reasons why Daniel 9:27's ultimate fulfillment could not be found in the events of 70 AD. And the most obvious reason is that the abomination of desolation refers most specifically to the desecrating action of a Gentile outsider who sets up a false god, or sets himself up as a false god in the Holy of Holies. And Titus did not do this. This is very clear in history. In fact, history tells us he didn't even step foot into the temple until it was already on fire and about to be destroyed. But what's more is that history even records that Titus actually ordered his men to preserve the temple, to not destroy it. He did not want it destroyed. He was impressed by it, and he was actually sad when it was destroyed. But yet his soldiers set it on fire anyway due to their anger against the Jews. after that long siege. And they knocked it down piece by piece to find every bit of gold that's melted and slipped in between the cracks. So in some ways, you can make the argument that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple was a type of an abomination of desolation event, and yet it doesn't completely fit the bill regarding everything the Bible tells us about the ultimate and final desolation. Again, parallel prophetic passages in the Bible tell us that the ultimate future abomination of desolation is going to involve the Antichrist physically standing in the Holy of Holies, in the temple, in Jerusalem, claiming to be God. We see that in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. So then it's impossible to apply the full and ultimate fulfillment of Daniel 9:27 to Titus Vespasian and the events of 70 AD, because at most it can represent a partial near-term fulfillment or a prophetic type or a shadow that's going to be ultimately fulfilled by the Antichrist in the future 70th week or the tribulation. And so, although it can be confusing to read Daniel 9:26 and 27 in isolation and without the benefit of other clarifying parallel passages, we really shouldn't allow that to cause us to misinterpret the text and jump to these conclusions like preterists and others do. We can't view Daniel 9 in isolation. We have to take into account the totality of the biblical commentary on this subject, because when we do, it's very clearly future oriented. It's a future prophecy that still has to be fulfilled. So understanding these peculiarities that we've talked about, hidden gaps and multiple reference prophecies, these prophetic characteristics, because we see them repeated in the Bible throughout from cover to cover, they help us to understand how the he in verse 27 can seemingly flow right after verse 26 and yet be separated by this hidden gap of time that up to this point has been almost 2,000 years, and we don't know how much longer it's going to go for. And how the he can have a more ultimate identification despite the fact that it follows the antecedent Titus Vespasian in the previous verse. Well, I know that this has been a lot of information to take in, especially if it's all new to you guys. I'm sure some of you know this information very well, but unfortunately, you probably don't hear this kind of teaching in church, which is the reason for what I do. If the church was doing its job, people wouldn't need to be going to YouTube to learn about the Bible. So I know it may have been a lot of information and maybe even a little bit difficult to follow at times. I'm sorry for that. I tried to make it as easy to follow as possible, but I do want to offer you this presentation also in article format. If you'd like that, it's on my website. It's easy to find in the articles tab. It has a very obvious title, and you can take your time reading through it, share it with friends, whatever. But I hope you guys take advantage of all these free resources that I try to provide. So thank you all for watching. God bless you. Please share this, leave a comment, and I will see you guys on the next video.